Mr. President.
The Republican whip.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection.
Mr. President, over the last few days, our friends across the aisle have been telling the American people that we have a choice when it comes to the extension of long-term unemployment benefits. On one hand, they're saying we can do exactly what the President and Senator Reid and his allies want, which is extend benefits for 3 months at a cost of $6.5 billion that we'll have to borrow from somebody, or we'll do nothing at all. Well, Mr. President, I'm here to suggest that that is a false choice, as President Obama likes to say from time to time. A false choice. We can do better than that. As a matter of fact, several of my Republican colleagues have offered their suggestions. I have in my hand a list of 23 amendments that would deal with everything from improving access to workforce training to finding a way to pay for this money that would otherwise have to be borrowed from the Chinese or other creditors of the United States and added to our $17.3 trillion debt. In other words, there's a lot of good ideas here that, if given an opportunity to debate them and offer these amendments and actually do what the Senate used to do, as the Republican leader said yesterday, we actually used to have committees that voted on amendments and then passed bills that came to the floor. We used to actually have an open amendment process where people could offer their amendments and then we would debate them and vote on them. What a novel idea. That's, of course, called legislating. And that's what the legislative branch, Congress, is supposed to be doing, but that's not what we have been doing. And so I hope that the majority leader, who basically is the traffic cop for the Senate floor, he's the one that determines whether or not we have an opportunity to have this sort of fulsome debate, to offer these constructive, bipartisan, in many instances, ideas to try to reform our unemployment compensation system and help grow the economy, help the private sector create jobs and get more people back to work so they don't have to depend on extended unemployment insurance. Or if they do find themselves in difficult circumstances, as many Americans unfortunately have, that they can then go back to school using Pell Grants, for example, to go to our community colleges, which do a fantastic job on helping people learn new skills that make them a good fit for the good jobs for which there are many, but there's not enough of the skilled workforce qualified for those jobs. But just to give the Senate a flavor for some of the ideas, my colleague from Oklahoma, Senator Coburn, who is always full of a lot of ideas, he's filed an amendment to ensure that people don't claim unemployment insurance and Social Security disability benefits simultaneously. Simultaneously, at the same time, claim disability benefits and claim unemployment benefits at the same time. If there's a case of double dipping, that would seem to be it, and it's an abuse of the system. He's also filed an amendment that would prevent millionaires and billionaires from receiving unemployment checks. I know it's hard to believe, but people with incomes over $1 million or more have claimed nearly $21 million worth of unemployment benefits in a single year. Isn't that unbelievable? What an abuse. What an insult, really, to the people who are in dire straits and who do need help, to know that there are people gaming the system, either by double dipping or being millionaires claiming unemployment benefits. Again, we borrowed $250 billion for paying these extended unemployment benefits since 2008, and here's some millionaires and billionaires who are gaming the system to their benefit. Well, why wouldn't we want to fix that? Why wouldn't we want to have a vote on those good ideas by my colleague, our colleague, Senator Coburn? Meanwhile, our colleague from South Carolina, Senator Scott, has filed a common sense amendment that would define full-time employment as a 40-hour work week for the purposes of Obamacare. The presiding officer and since he walked in, I'll pick on him, my friend from Maryland, remembers we had a number of leaders of organized labor that came to the White House and said that Obamacare is turning full-time work into part-time work because of the penalties associated with the employer mandate and the like. Many employers were shifting full-time workers into part-time work. So this is not just a concern on this side of the aisle. It is a broad concern that's impacting a lot of people. I remember recently being in Tyler, Texas, at a diner where the owner of that diner said he tragically had to put a single mom on a 30-hour work week in order to avoid some of the penalties of Obamacare. So to make up for that lost income, she's had to go get a second part-time job because of Obamacare and its unintended consequences. So Senator Scott's got an amendment that would address that problem, and I hope that the majority leader will rethink his long-standing position, at least over the last 6 months, of basically shutting out any other constructive ideas, not just on this side of the aisle, but on the other side of the aisle as well, as the Republican leader pointed out yesterday. In addition, our colleague from Indiana, Senator Coates, has several ideas. One would offset the extension of long-term unemployment benefits by delaying the individual and employer mandates under Obamacare until 2015. Now, we'll all recall that the President and this administration, on its own initiative, I'm looking hard to find where they have the authority, but they nevertheless did. They delayed the employer mandate for a year on their own. Well, this would take the money saved from delaying the individual employer mandate and use that to pay for the extension of unemployment benefits. Another amendment would offset the cost of this extension by requiring people to provide a Social Security number before they claim the earned income, before they claim the child tax credit. All it would do is to make them provide a Social Security number to make sure that we root out fraud and abuse in the child tax credit claims. It would save billions of dollars, and it would allow us to pay for this short-term extension of unemployment, long-term unemployment benefits. I would add, I think most people need to be reminded that actually the basic program of unemployment insurance covers people for up to half a year. But over the last 5 years, Congress has extended that up to 99 weeks, about two years. Well, this is supposed to be an emergency program. And thankfully, the economy is starting to show some signs of improvement and growth. So what we need to do is to get off of this temporary emergency measure and get back to normal circumstances and to try to find ways to pay our bills and to make sure that people don't abuse the American taxpayer by gaming the system. And we continue to look for ways to help people learn the skills they need in order to get the good, high-paying jobs that exist, among other things. Well, here's another idea. Our colleague from New Hampshire, Senator Ayotte, has filed an amendment that would restore the military pension benefits. This is something, remember, that was taken out of the Murray-Ryan budget deal that passed before we left for Christmas. And I think it's fair to say there's broad bipartisan support for restoring those cuts to the military pensions, and Senator Ayotte's amendment would do that. All of these amendments, Mr. President, would deserve debate, which I'm trying in some small way to provide here, but others have their ideas and have their way of talking about it, and they also deserve a vote. But again, the majority leader, Senator Reid, is the traffic cop on the Senate floor. And as Senator McConnell pointed out yesterday, the Senate has been radically transformed from a place where we actually used to have, well, we actually used to be able to justifiably claim the Senate as the greatest deliberative body on the planet, but no more. But we can return to the way the Senate used to be by having this sort of constructive, bipartisan, fulsome discussion and votes on good ideas. and make legislation better and not settle for something less. Well, I said that, and it's true, that senators have a right to debate and offer legislation. Now, I'm not sure that many people across America have thought very deeply about what that means. But this isn't about the presiding officer's rights as a United States Senator or my rights as a United States Senator, but this is about the rights and the voice of the 26 million people I represent. Because when I'm shut out of the process, when I can't offer amendments and ideas about how to improve legislation, they're shut out as well. And that's wrong.
Senator's time has expired.
Mr. President, I was unaware that there was a time limit, but I would ask unanimous consent for an additional 5 minutes.
Without objection?
Thank you. Well, so these amendments represent just a small sample of the ideas that our side of the aisle has put forward to help the long-term unemployed and to accelerate job creation and to grow the economy, something that I know we all want. We all want it. So why not let's talk about it? Why not let's vote on these ideas? Why not let's get the Senate back into position where we have the give and take of ideas and where we come up with the best for the American people? A couple other amendments. My colleagues from Ohio and Kansas, Senator Portman and Senator Roberts, have each introduced legislation that would increase accountability and much stronger safeguards in the U.S. regulatory system. Regulations are what the bureaucracy does. You can't vote for them or against them. You can't hold them accountable that way, and they're out of control. If you want to know why those bills are so important, last year alone the Obama administration imposed $112 billion worth of new regulations on the U.S. economy, $112 billion worth of new regulations in 2013 alone. And our colleague from Alaska, Senator Murkowski, who's the ranking member of the Energy Committee, is rightly concerned about the misguided impact of regulations on our energy industry, primarily the oil and gas industry. And she's taken the time to draft a bold plan for reforming U.S. energy policy that would promote economic growth, job creation, national security, and responsible stewardship of our environment. I want to recognize as well, in conclusion, in terms of this, the summary of some of the ideas, 23 of which I have on this card, but I'll just mention a few of them, the ideas of our colleague from Utah, Senator Mike Lee, and recognize his efforts to reform our dysfunctional tax system in a way that supports middle-class families who are working hard to provide for their children. We should agree, as Senator Lee has advocated, that the tax reform should aim not just to simplify the tax code and fuel job growth, but also to ease the burden on hard-working middle-class families. So, Mr. President, there are a lot of great ideas out there. I can't think of a better time to talk about them than this, when the President of the United States has made a priority over income inequality, which unfortunately is the worst, become worse under his administration, not better, further exacerbated by burdens like Obamacare, which we find out is just a bundle of broken promises when it comes to, if you like what you could have, you can keep it. It'll lower your costs, not increase it. We find out none of that is true. But there are a lot of great ideas that we could, working together in the interest of the American people, agree on that would actually improve their economic situation, that would help restore the American dream. But what is the American dream to somebody who has been out of work and can't find a work? Well, it's a disappointment, to say the least. So we need to help people not maintain their dependency on a government benefit in perpetuity, but to liberate them from that dependency, to help them regain their self-respect and sense of dignity by finding work and providing for themselves and their families and to live their version of the American dream. And in the process, we all benefit. The federal government can pay its bills because people are paying taxes, because they have good jobs, and America will be the same America we inherited from our parents and grandparents, and hopefully we will make it better for the next generation and beyond. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I have 3 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I have taken the floor of the United States Senate, and when I was a member of the House, the floor of the House, to talk about circumstances that are occurring somewhere in the world where people are being killed, displaced, people are being uprooted simply because of their ethnicity. Ethnic cleansing has occurred around the world, and I've taken the opportunity to put a spotlight on it in an effort to say that the civilized world needs to bring an end to that type of crimes against humanity. I've used the opportunity as a member of the Helsinki Commission and now as chairman of the Helsinki Commission to point out that our priority, America's priority, needs to be a leader in the world to prevent ethnic cleansing. Many of us believed after World War II that the world would never allow again to see circumstances where people were killed simply because of the ethnic community that they belonged to. I've talked about Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, Syria, and now, Mr. President, we see the same thing happening again in the South Sudan. I just came from a hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that was convened on the crisis in the South Sudan. 2 witnesses, the Honorable Linda Thomas Greenfield, the Assistant Secretary, Bureau of African Affairs, and the Honorable Nancy Lindberg, Assistant Administrator, Bureau of Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance, is giving an update to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as to the circumstances in the South Sudan and what we can do to try to bring about a resolution. I rise today to discuss the deteriorating circumstances in the South Sudan. As some of my colleagues may know, ongoing political tensions between forces loyal to President Salva Kiir and forces loyal to the former Vice President Riek Machar, coupled with pre-existing ethnic tensions, erupted in violence the night of December 15th. I joined the President and Secretary Kerry in calling for an immediate end to the violence in the South Sudan. Currently, it's estimated that nearly 200,000 people have been internally displaced as a result of the conflict, with another 32,000 having fled to neighboring states. The UN estimates that thousands of Sudanese people have been killed since December 15th. Now, Mr. President, let me just remind my colleagues that 3 years ago today, the people of the South Sudan started a voting process that led to, later that year, their independence as the youngest new country in the world. Our U.S. Ambassador, Susan Page, has remained in Juba, along with a security detail and a minimum key personnel. I want to thank her. This is courage to be able to remain in the South Sudan so that we have our leadership on the ground to try to help the people. I applaud her bravery and sacrifice and those that are with her. The worsening violence has spurred a humanitarian crisis, and President nominated Ambassador Booth to be our ambassador to that region to try to get a peace process started. He's currently in Ethiopia trying to get the international community to respond to a political solution to the South Sudan. The international community has responded rapidly, including by working to significantly expand the size of the UN mission in the South Sudan. But since the evacuation of foreign aid workers, most humanitarian agencies and the international NGOs are heavily reliant on brave South Sudanese staff who put their lives at risk to help their people. There are so many, these are large numbers for the country of Sudan, the number of people displaced, the number of people being killed. Let me just share with my colleagues one of many examples of the crisis, how it's affected people in that region. I recently learned that on the onset of the December clashes, one local staff person from an American NGO was rounded up along with 7 members of his family and taken to a police station in Juba. He ultimately escaped to the UN compound, but his family was killed, along with more than 200 others. He is from the Nuer ethnic group, which now lives in fear of ethnic targeting by members of the country's security force from another ethnic group, the Dinkas. Media reports also suggest that individuals in uniforms have entered the UN bases in several locations and forcibly removed civilians taking shelter there. On December 21st, 2 UN peacekeepers were killed after a group attacked a UN peacekeeping base that was sheltering 20 civilians. There is no safe harbor today in the South Sudan. If the UN base can be overrun and people killed because of their ethnicity, the international community must respond. I remain extremely concerned at the reports out of the South Sudan, all of which suggest serious crimes against humanity are occurring in the country. The world cannot stand by and bear witness to another ethnic cleansing, as we saw in so many other places in the world. We must do all that we can to ensure a peaceful resolution of the crisis and accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity in South Sudan. Mr. President, our first priority is to get peace on the ground, to stop the killings, so people can live in peace. We need to work with the international community so humanitarian aid can get to the people who need it. And that's very challenging, considering that NGOs, international NGOs, cannot operate today in the South Sudan. And we must hold accountable those who have committed crimes against humanity. We've said it over and over again. But unless we hold accountable those who have perpetrated these atrocities, we will see it again and again and again. The United States leadership is critically important to make sure that we document what has taken place and that we bring to justice those who are responsible for the crimes that have been committed. There's no question that the solution to the crisis in the South Sudan must be political, not military. We understand that. South Sudan, again, is at a crossroads, and after coming so far, it must choose to renounce violence immediately and pursue a path of peace and reconciliation. I am encouraged that President Kerr and former President Bashir have sent negotiators to Ethiopia to participate in mediation talks. And while these talks are a good first step, in the interim, the violence must end and both sides must be committed to negotiating in good faith. It is my hope that these talks can bring about a bright future so many South Sudanese aspire for. The people of the South Sudan deserve to understand the true meaning of safety and security, of peace and prosperity. The United States stands with the people of South Sudan through these difficult times. We must pledge to continue to support those who seek peace, democracy, human rights, and justice for all of the citizens of the world's newest nation. With that, Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of the quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. A quorum call on the floor of the Senate as senators are in the midst of general speeches. The chamber will recess from 12:30 until 2:15 today. And then when they return, lawmakers will formally continue debate on a bill that would extend unemployment insurance benefits by 3 months. Benefits for the long-term unemployed ran out in December. A simple majority vote will be needed today for approval. Votes on the bipartisan bill are possible this afternoon. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie is right now responding to allegations that he or his office intentionally blocked traffic on New York's George Washington Bridge to retaliate against the mayor of Fort Lee, New Jersey, for failing to endorse him. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, according to the Associated Press, has fired a top aide who engineered political playback against the town mayor, saying that she lied. Deputy Chief of Staff Bridget Ann Kelly is the latest casualty in a widening scandal that threatens to upend Christie's second term and likely run for president in 2016. He is in the midst of a news conference about that right now, and we are carrying it live on C-SPAN. Afterwards, we'll take your phone calls. While this quorum call is underway, House Oversight Committee this morning is holding a hearing examining government waste and strategies to reduce it. Panelists also are looking at ways to increase government efficiencies. We'll take you there live right now as this quorum call continues.
The GAO, outside groups, we need to pick and choose our battles. We can't because our funding is limited, and so we'd love to work more with you.
Combined firepower may be some unified effort. I've exceeded my time. Let me yield to gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney.
Panelists for your excellent presentation and your hard work in a tremendously important area. The prior panel had a consensus that one of the most mismanaged agencies was the Pentagon, and they were united in their belief that the Treasury should be paying their books or paying their checks, writing their checks, as opposed to the Pentagon. They pointed out the Pentagon was the only agency in the entire government that themselves pays their checks. And I'd just like to go down the aisle with your, do you believe that the Pentagon should be able to pay their checks, or should they be just like every other agency and have Treasury pay them? And just a yes or no answer. Mr. Chavez?
Yes.
You think they, pardon me?
They should turn it over to another agency.
Yeah. Mr. Edwards?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think one thing Congress can do could give the Pentagon a fixed amount of cuts they want to see from efficiency, but then give the Pentagon flexibility to find those cuts and propose them to Congress.
Mr. Arnold?
Yes, I agree.
Ms. Wu?
I will say that USPIRG has worked with NTU on a number of different reports that we've written in conjunction about the Common Ground. And we've also worked with Senator Coburn's office to help write this report. On that matter, I would say that USPIRG is not an expert on defense policy and defense spending and so forth. And so I will give a yes or no answer in that. But we do take the authority and the authoritative consensus of various experts, the Pentagon and the White House and so forth.
Well, Ms. Wu, you were very strong on the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter debacle, as you called it in your report, or NYPIRG did. And this is one of the key programs that NYPIRG and NTU, their joint recommendation is cutting it, the Joint Strike Fighter, which is the largest weapons system in history and largest contract in history for the Pentagon. And so far, the DoD has spent 12 years developing it, and by all consensus, their own consensus, is deeply flawed and has escalated with cost overruns to over $400 billion. Not only are the overruns now at $400 billion, they're estimating that it cost $1 trillion to maintain these planes. And the price tag is not the only frightening thing about this acquisition. DoD entered into the contract to purchase these planes while critical testing is ongoing, a practice called concurrency. So at the end of 2012, the DoD had procured 121 aircraft at a cost of $28 billion. But as of 2012, only 22% of the testing that they want to do has been completed. So I would say that this is an area we can work on. We shouldn't be handing out contracts before you've tested them, and I'm going to put in a bill to that effect. And according to the Pentagon's own Office of Operational Tests and Evaluation in 2013, the plane has, quote, no night capacity. So my question, Ms. Wu, would you think that a fighter plane should be able to fly in the night?
I do believe that's
okay. And do you agree with DOD's own statements from the Chief of Acquisition called it, and I quote, this is a quote from the Chief of Acquisition. I find it startling. He calls it, quote, acquisition malpractice. Now, would you agree with the head of the Chief Acquisition, Undersecretary Frank Kendall? Would you agree that it's acquisition malpractice, which has happened? This is the DOD talking about their own procurement system.
Yes.
And does the acquisition, what I don't understand, and we can get into a longer conversation on this, is, you know, how does an acquisition of a fighter plane become such a debacle that the own acquisition officers are calling it a disaster? But my main question is, what steps does DOD need to take in order to eliminate the wasteful and unnecessary F-35 program? And it's noted in other reports, it may have been yours, Ms. Wu, or someone else's, that it doesn't even address the way that we are moving militarily. It can't land on an aircraft. The Navy has these big boats that the planes land on. The Navy plane cannot land on their own aircraft. So how do you move it around? And we seem to be having these smaller strike forces as opposed to a huge plane that can't fly at night and can't land. So what are the steps that DOD would need to take to eliminate what by their own acquisition leadership, Mr. Kendall is calling an acquisition disaster? What are the steps? Anyone? How do you get rid of a wasteful item in the budget? How would you do that?
Well, one of the recommendations we have in Prime Cuts is to reduce the cost growth in the major defense acquisition portfolio by 20% over 5 years. GAO has done a lot of work on this. It's simply changing the way that procurement is achieved at DOD, and it's been an ongoing problem for many, many years. So it's a big operation. We're happy to work with this committee and others to try to reform it in the future.
Any other comment? How do you get rid of a wasteful acquisition like this? How do you get rid of it? You've identified it. Now how do you get rid of it?
I don't know if it's fair to put the onus solely on DOD. I think it's probably going to require congressional action as well. And you're talking about these massive weapons systems. You're talking about a lot of parochial interests that are involved. So it's extraordinarily difficult. But I think Congress needs to run point. I mean, we have a significant number of weapon systems and other things being done by DOD that they say they do not need and they do not want. Yet they are obligated by law to continue to contract, to produce, to maintain. So Congress needs to step in at some point, and there's a lot of options in our paper and in the publications that Coburn and others have put out that Congress can introduce legislation and pass it and stop these things from taking place.
Thank the gentlelady and the witness, Mr. Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Edwards, I want to ask you a question about incentivizing agencies and agency individuals. Right now, the incentive for an agency is to add more staff and to try to chase down more dollars and to spend as much as you can at the end of the year. How do we flip that incentive? You mentioned spending caps. Sequestration caps and other caps are really hit at every single program. There are some programs that run more efficiently than others, but a cap like sequestration hits all of them with equal amount of fury. If I hand to an agency the authority to say, I need you to cut 7% from your budget or 27% from your budget, there's very little oversight of which programs they're going to cut. They'll keep the ones they like the best, and they'll cut the ones that probably I like the best. So talk through different options that you have seen for incentivizing agencies in reduction.
I mean, I think ultimately for reasons I go into in my testimony, I list 15 reasons why the public sector will never be anywhere near as efficient as the private sector. The profit motive in the private sector is usually powerful, and the government doesn't have that. Government, there's been lots of talk for pay for performance in the federal government for decades, but it never really happens, and I don't think it can. The government has more rules because of basic structural reasons to prevent public corruption, and because they have no clear motive like lowering costs and maximizing revenue. So I think the focus should be on fully eliminating programs and also capping spending, giving executive branch agencies more flexibility. I think executive branch agencies should and can do more to evaluate their own programs. Perhaps agencies should be required to do detailed analyses and rank order their most efficient or highest priority programs to the lowest priority programs, and make the information public so that Congress can see it and Congress can use it for decision making. More information is always better. You know, one thing that I find really striking about federal agencies, you go to their websites, it's all good news, it's all essentially propaganda about all the great, fabulous things they do, but I don't think that's fair to taxpayers. I think federal agencies should be required to provide more balanced information about their programs, their failings, and what the low priority activities they do are. And the ultimate decision is up to Congress, but I think agencies can do more to provide information to Congress about where they fail.
Yeah, I would agree that the taxpayers' right to know that Dr. Coburn had mentioned earlier. That's my bill here in the House. We've talked about this committee has passed. We had bipartisan input into that bill, and it's passed, and I hope the full House will pass it on and we'll send it over to the Senate. But just the basics of knowing what every program is, how much we spend, how many people they serve, and the metrics, if there are any metrics for a program, would be a tremendous asset to Congress to make those decisions, because right now, there's no description of all those programs nor listing of the programs. So what Dr. Coburn can mention earlier about the hundreds of duplicative programs, it's very difficult to go through the tedious work of identifying all those programs because they'll all have different descriptions in different locations.
That's right.
Mr. Schatz, as well, I appreciate you had mentioned earlier about the rule change in the House. I'm proud to say that was actually my rule change that went through on that one as well, to try to identify some of the duplicative programs. We have a long way to go on that, and you're right, there's not enough teeth to it, and I appreciate you bringing it back out, because that is something that I hope in the years ahead we can continue to add more teeth to it, so it's more than just identifying and listing, yes, this is duplicative, but a prohibition to that as well. Are there other rule change things that you have seen that would be an asset in the days ahead for the functioning of the House?
Well, I think it reminds me a little bit of the Improper Payments Act. The first one just identified the improper payments, then the next two really put some teeth into it. So I hope that the rule that has been adopted would improve over the years, because if you're prohibited from enacting a duplicative and overlapping program, then that helps solve that problem to start. So I know rules change at the beginning of each Congress. I hope if there's a change in leadership, that rule continues, because it's really critical. It's amazing it took this long to have a rule like that, because one would think any organization wouldn't want to create a duplicative program. So we appreciate your leadership on that, and we're happy to come up with some other rules, but I was happy to see that that one was there, because to be honest, when we started our research for the testimony, we didn't even know it was there. And so that's something else that perhaps needs to be emphasized to the committees, that this is a rule and they should be using it, because again, if Citizens Against Government Waste didn't know much about it, the rest of the public probably doesn't know either. So right. I encourage more information about what you've been doing.
Right. It's new, and it's a step process to be able to push on that. And I have one quick question as well from Mr. Arnold and Ms. Wu on it. One of the items that you identified was requiring DOD and VA to jointly buy prescription drugs. This is something that I've tracked through as well. I've seen figures. You have a little over $4 billion in savings on that. I've seen figures as high as $7 billion in savings on that. I didn't know if you wanted to mention or add any other detail to it. The GAO report came out in early 2000 suggesting that DOD and VA jointly purchase prescription drugs. They did it for several years, had millions of dollars of savings until 2005. And then in 2006, DOD changed its formulary, and they never really cooperated again since then. They've studied it. They've looked at it again. But I didn't know if you had any additional detail on it. That's one of those bipartisan areas to look at and say, why wouldn't we try to combine the drug purchasing between DOD and VA? Any other comments that either of you have on that?
I think you articulated pretty well, actually. I don't know if I have anything additional to add, but
okay.
Something we strongly support.
Thank you.
Yeah, and same, just to repeat kind of what you were saying, that collaboration had really declined over the past few years, and we're really advocating for that to occur again. So.
Okay, thank you. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Duckworth, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to all the witnesses for being here today to share your thoughts. Over the past couple of weeks, we've been debating whether or not we can afford to extend unemployment insurance for a lifeline for millions of Americans. And in my home district of Illinois, thousands of families. We talked about last year cuts to the food stamps program. Yet at the same time, in this very committee, we saw time and again the waste that happens in government. And it's really infuriating to me to think that I have kids in my district who are going hungry, and yet there's $900 million worth of unused Stryker parts sitting in a warehouse that the military paid for but couldn't use and continue to purchase. I'd like to sort of talk a little bit more about the DOD and its process. You know, this past year, my first year in Congress, two things that happened that really sort of crystallized in my mind the waste that happens in DOD, especially under the Defense Logistics Agency. One was a hearing in this very committee on the Supreme Food Contract, and that is this corporation, Supreme Food Services, that provide under a sole contract all the food in Afghanistan for the last decade, and in fact has now been found to have overcharged the DOD by $757 million for that food contract. They continue to get extensions to the contract in a non-competitive award process. This was something that the DOD's IG itself discovered and brought to light. And then I talked about the Stryker part, also, again, a result of a DOD IG investigation. Mr. Arnold, could you give me any suggestions that you might have as to how DOD can develop some sort of controls over the DLA? I know that, you know, we talked about the audit process, and I absolutely agree. We need to put some teeth into the process of forcing DOD to do the audits. But what about the DLA itself? I mean, if the DOD's own internal IG is identifying these as problems, what is there that we can do?
Well, let me confess, first of all, I was a co-author of this study, and I didn't work quite as much on the defense aspects of it. So in terms of getting into the real technical details, I would have to defer to my colleague, Pete Sepp, who did a lot of work, or perhaps some folks at PIRG. So I don't know that I have a really articulate answer for you. I apologize for that, but be happy to get back to you after the hearing.
No problem. Ms. Wu?
In terms of the consolidations that we found that could occur in the Defense Department, a lot of them include, and it's listed in our report, consolidating foreign language contracts, uniform designs for all the armed services, or support services at armed joint bases, or consolidating management of retail bases. These are all the smaller things that can add up to a lot of money in the end. In terms of the process of how that would go about, you know, as I mentioned before, USPIRG, we're not defense experts, and we don't you know, have anything to say about the process by which it would happen, but these are the things that need to be addressed and need to be consolidated and need to be cut, especially because, you know, I think as Senator Coburn had said, we have so many programs, over 600 programs for other departments, and the same for the Defense Department when there are multiple programs for designing uniforms. That needs to be addressed.
Well, the uniform thing is right after my heart. I'm actually the individual who got passed in this year's NDAA, the single camouflage pattern bill that will save the Army alone $82 million by going back to a single camouflage pattern, which is what we had for most of my entire time in the military up until 2004 when the Marines developed their own. So, Ms. Wu, let's sort of switch gears a little bit and talk about Medicare. I recently had an event in my district where we taught our seniors to look into Medicare fraud and waste, taught them to read their own Medicare statements. And one of the things that was quite shocking to me is that the regional Medicare representative who came to teach the course actually made the statement that they know that 10% of their payments are to fraudulent and wasteful claims, that they know and accept that they have that 10% waste, and that they're working to fix it. But that comes out to about $1 billion a week. It is stunning to me that that is acceptable. I don't think that we would accept it in business, and we shouldn't accept it in government. Can you talk a little bit about Medicare, just the waste portion of it, not just the fraud and abuse, because that we can deal with, but the waste?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, that's appalling to me as well, the fact that they readily, knowingly accept that 10%, I think you said 10%, goes goes to fraudulent claims and improper payments. But yeah, there are a lot of different, as listed in our report, there are several different entitlement reforms within the healthcare system that we have advocated for. One of them is better aligning Medicare payments to teaching hospitals. So Medicare, the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, or MedPAC, has actually stated that the cost of teaching hospitals is much less than the amount of government funding that we're providing them. So better aligning that would save over $10 billion in the next 10 years. And then there's plenty of other things, bundling Medicare payments so that a single payment goes to a number of different individual episodes in a 3-month period. That would also advocate for more effective use of time, more effective and efficient actual services. And so these are the types of things that we think that are really important within the healthcare system that we can and should change.
Thank the gentlelady, and we'll recognize now the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Walberg.
I thank the chairman, and I just arrived back from meeting with Ed and Workforce Committee, and was delighted to hear Senator Coburn talk about the Skills Act extensively as being one of our greatest accomplishments, even though it be limited. And I think it was. Downsizing the numbers of redundant programs, 35 ineffective, duplicative programs, including 27 identified in the 2011 Government Accountability Office. I guess I would like to ask any of you who would like to weigh in, with the fact that this is unfortunately languished in the Senate, and in fact what they are even thinking about offering includes only one of our proposals in that Skills Act. Could you discuss further proposals to remove arbitrary roadblocks that will help get Americans back to work in the jobs that are currently in demand? And I know on my own Michigan website, the mijobs.gov, lists 52,000 unfilled jobs right now. And most of those, and we know that there are many more than that, but that's on that one website, a state government website. And the majority of reasons why they're not being filled is people don't meet the certification requirements, the qualifications. They haven't been trained for that. So if you could speak to that issue, what proposals would you have in mind to remove further arbitrary roadblocks to making people employable? Mr. Schatz, I'll start with you if you would care to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Walberg. Certainly creating pro-growth policies here in Washington would be helpful. And certainly that does not entail creating new and duplicative programs. As Dr. Coburn noted, he examined the job training programs in Oklahoma. It turned out the state was far more efficient at creating jobs because the training that they were conducting was related to jobs. And that's something that the government should be looking at as well. I know that in the House, the Skills Act was supported strongly by Republicans, not supported as much by Democrats, some differences in how it should be done. But whether it's through legislation, whether it's through pro-growth policies, tax reform, there are many other ways to help create jobs. The government needs to be more out of the way than trying to force its own view on how jobs should be created, because that's not something that we ever found in the Constitution, yet members seem to think creating jobs is one of their major functions.
As opposed to getting out of the way,
right,
so that people who do know how to create jobs can do that, including our states. And I think that was one of the best points of the Skills Act. It did give the flexibility back and the opportunity back to the states to do. Mr. Edwards?
Yeah, a broad comment on job training. I've looked in detail at the job training programs over the decades, and it is astounding. The federal job training programs have never really worked very well. Back over a half a century to John F. Kennedy, every decade or so, we reorganize them and change them and try to fix them. But the GAO comes back every time and basically says, you can't really show that these things work very well. I think the federal government ought to get out of the job training business. If you look at the data, it is the corporate sector, the business sector in the United States does a much more massive job training on the job training. And the federal government's 18 or so billion is a tiny drop in the bucket. it hasn't really worked very well. I take the federal government out of that business. In terms of pro-growth policies, there's a gigantic, it's outside the jurisdiction of this committee, but there's a gigantic reform that is on the plate here. There should be bipartisan support for, and that's corporate tax reform. We've got the highest corporate tax rate in the world. It absolutely makes no sense. You read in the newspaper every few weeks or every month or two about major corporations who are moving jobs elsewhere, often because of the corporate tax problem we've got. President Obama says he's for corporate tax reform. Republicans are for it. Why we can't do that, I don't understand. Our neighbor to the north, our largest trading partner, Canada, has a 15% corporate income tax. We got a 35% rate. It makes no sense at all. That is a big thing we can do, because when businesses, they have a lower corporate rate, they invest more, they buy more machines, and when you buy more machines and investment, you need workers to run those machines. The corporate tax cut would be a huge jobs bill in my view.
Mr. Arnold.
I'll concur with both Chris and Tom, but also add, at the state level especially, we see licensure laws that place real strong restrictions on the amount of job growth that can occur within a particular field of expertise. And we understand when those are created for surgeons, et cetera, but when those are created for things like interior decorators, they're just protectionism on the part of some of these trade associations that, again, limit the access of people seeking jobs to actually become employed.
I'm out of time, but could Ms. Wu
Go right ahead and respond.
Just to add a quick note, in terms of job growth, I'm not going to say anything much just in terms of the confines of our report, but at the same time, the federal government is spending billions each year subsidizing large agribusinesses, which really put small farmers, small businesses at competitive disadvantages. Tax loopholes and tax havens where companies are able to shift their profit offshore and use a 0% tax rate or a very, very minimal tax rate really puts small businesses at competitive disadvantages and really hurts taxpayers in that they have to now pick up the tab through cuts to public programs or more debt or higher taxes. And that could really put a damper on job growth and put a damper on being able to find a job and being able to pick up, your household in that kind of way. So, yeah, I end my statement there.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. Recognized gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I really think that all of the members of this committee agree that waste in government and unnecessary spending is unacceptable. It also appears to me that members will probably agree that this committee is well positioned to investigate and examine issues of waste and conduct legitimate oversight.
The Senate as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, my colleague from South Carolina will shortly join me on the floor, but I will make some remarks while I am waiting. And, Mr. President, when the Senator from South Carolina joins me, I ask unanimous consent to engage in a colloquy with the Senator from South Carolina.
Without objection.
Some of us were here in the Senate 10 years ago in 2004 when U.S. troops led two major offensives against al-Qaeda and other militants in the Iraqi city of Fallujah. Some of us remember how 146 of our brave men and women in uniform lost their lives and more than 1,000 were wounded in those fights were some of the bloodiest and toughest battles since the Vietnam War. Success was costly, but success we did. And here we are 10 years later, and al-Qaeda fighters have once again raised their black flags over Fallujah, and they're battling to control other parts of Iraq. This tragic setback is leading many of our brave Iraq war veterans, and especially those who shed their blood and risked their lives and lost their friends fighting in Fallujah, questioning what their sacrifice was worth, and sadly, they find themselves agreeing with Congressman Duncan Hunter, a former Marine who fought in Fallujah. And I quote, "We did our job," said Congressman Hunter. "We did what we were asked to do and we won. Every single man and woman who fought in Iraq, especially in those cities, feels a kick in the gut for all they did because this president decided to squander their sacrifice." Prior to 2011, President Obama frequently referred to a, quote, responsible withdrawal from Iraq, which was based on, quote, leaving behind a stable and representative government in Baghdad and, quote, avoiding a power vacuum that terrorists could exploit. The President's Deputy National Security Advisor, Anthony Blinken, stated in 2012 that, quote, Iraq, and I'm not making this up, Iraq today is less violent, more democratic, and more prosperous than at any time in recent history. Based on the President's own markers, the administration is falling short of its own goals. The illusion of a stable and representative government has been shattered by increasing sectarian tension, and it's clear that terrorists are exploiting the power vacuum left behind. The Obama administration blames Iraqis for failing to grant the necessary privileges and immunities for a U.S. force presence beyond 2011. This is misleading, in fact false, because as we saw firsthand, the administration never undertook the necessary diplomatic effort to reach such an agreement. The senator from South Carolina and I traveled to Iraq in May 2011, only several months away from the deadline that our commanders had set for the beginning of the withdrawal. We met with all the leaders of Iraq's main political blocs, and we heard a common message during all of these private conversations. Iraqi leaders recognized that it was in their country's interest to maintain a limited number of U.S. troops to continue training and assisting Iraqi security forces beyond 2011. But when we asked Ambassador Jeffrey and the commander of U.S. forces in Iraq, Lloyd Austin, while in a meeting with Prime Minister Maliki, how many U.S. troops remaining in Iraq would perform and how many the administration sought to maintain, they couldn't tell us, or the Iraqis. The White House still had not made a decision. It went on like this for the next few months. By August 2011, the leaders of Iraq's main political blocs joined together and stated they were prepared to enter negotiations to keep some U.S. troops in Iraq. An entire month passed, and still the White House made no decision. All the while, during this internal deliberation, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey later testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee, the size of a potential U.S. force presence kept cascading down from upwards of 16,000 to an eventual low of less than 3,000. By that point, the force would be able to do little rather than protect itself, and Prime Minister Maliki and other Iraqi leaders realized that the political cost of accepting this proposal was not worth the benefit. To blame this failure entirely on the Iraqis is convenient, but it misses the real point. The reason to keep around 10,000 to 15,000 U.S. forces in Iraq was not for the sake of Iraq alone. It was first and foremost in our national security interest to continue training and advising Iraqi forces and to maintain greater U.S. influence in Iraq. That core principles should have driven a very different U.S. approach to the SOFA, that's the Status of Forces Agreement, diplomacy. The Obama administration should have recognized that after years of brutal conflict, Iraqi leaders still lacked trust in one another, and a strong U.S. role was required to help Iraqis broker their most politically sensitive decisions. For this reason, the administration should have determined what tasks and troop numbers were in the national interest to maintain in Iraq, and done so with ample time to engage with Iraqis at the highest level of the U.S. government to shape political conditions in Baghdad to achieve our goal. We focus on this failure not because U.S. troops would have made a decisive difference in Iraq by engaging in unilateral combat operations against al-Qaeda and other threats to Iraq's stability. By 2011, U.S. forces were no longer in Iraqi cities or engaged in security operations. However, a residual U.S. troop presence could have assisted Iraqi forces in their continued fight against al-Qaeda. It could have provided a platform for greater diplomatic engagement and intelligence cooperation with our Iraqi partners. It could have made Iranian leaders think twice about using Iraqi airspace to transit military assistance and weapons and arms and equipment to Assad and his forces in Syria, and most importantly, it could have maintained the significant diplomatic influence that the United States at that time possessed in Iraq, influence that had been and still was essential in guaranteeing Iraq's nascent political system, reassuring Iraqi leaders that they could resolve their differences peacefully and politically despite their mistrust of one another, and checking the authoritarian and sectarian tendencies of Prime Minister Maliki and his allies. The administration's failure in Iraq has been further compounded by its failure in Syria. In Syria, where President Obama has refused to take any meaningful action, the initially peaceful protests of early 2011 were met by horrific violence by the Assad regime. This president and this administration has stood back and watched while over 130,000 people have been brutally killed and a fourth of the population displaced. In his promise to avoid military action and reduce U.S. footprint in the Middle East, we have seen the resurgence of al-Qaeda throughout the region. Hezbollah and Iran emboldened in Syria, Russia reasserting its presence for the first time since it was kicked out of Egypt by Egyptian President Sadat in 1973, and the destabilization of the region in ways that will inevitably reverberate back here in America. Again, there are those who may applaud President Obama's decision to disengage, arguing that this isn't America's problem to solve, that the U.S. is fundamentally limited in its ability to influence developments in the Middle East is a consistent theme within the administration. No one denies that there are limits to what the U.S. can do. That's always the case. But as Secretary Hillary Clinton told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as she was leaving office, quote, "Let me underscore the importance of the United States continuing to lead in the Middle East, North Africa, and around the world. When America is absent, especially from unstable environments, there are consequences. Extremism takes root, our interests suffer, and our security at home is threatened." Nowhere do her words ring more true than in Syria and Iraq today. Begging the question by fleeing Iraq and sidestepping Syria as the administration helped empower terrorist forces in ways that have created long-term threats to U.S. national security. I'm afraid it's hard to argue that the answer is no. The administration must recognize its failed policies and change its course. America has lost credibility and influence over the past years, and we simply can't afford to remain disengaged. It is time that America stand up and play its rightful role in resolving these conflicts to best serve American interests. It's time that we adopt a comprehensive strategy for addressing the growing threats that are now emanating from the region and move forward from a position of strength. The return of al-Qaeda to Anbar province is a sobering reminder for the administration that the tide of war is not receding. I see my colleague from South Carolina here. I'm sorry, I didn't realize you had come. I know that the senator from South Carolina and I need to discuss a recent unfortunate development in Afghanistan. But before we do, could I recall from my friend from South Carolina of the many, many visits, and I'd have lost count, the many visits that we made to Iraq from 2003 really up to 2012, that one of the most interesting visits we had was when we were in Ramadi and Colonel McFarland announced to us that the Sunni sheiks had come over, that the major sheik had come over, he had sent some tanks over, and that was the beginning of what we know as the Anbar Awakening, a turning point in the entire conflict which, coupled with the surge, changed the fortunes of war in Iraq. By the way, the surge being opposed vehemently by the President of the United States and the former Secretary of State then Senator Clinton, who stated in the hearing with General Petraeus that she would have to have a willing, I quote, willing suspension of disbelief in order to believe that the surge would succeed. But setting that aside, and then later, when we came back again to Fallujah and Ramadi, and the senator from South Carolina and I walked down the main street of Ramadi, down the main street with Iraqis everywhere, proving the success of the surge in Anbar province. And now the same streets that we walked through, the exact same streets, are now vehicles filled with al-Qaeda flying the black flag of al-Qaeda. The bloodiest conflict that was fought in our entire involvement in Iraq was the Second Battle of Fallujah. 95 brave Americans killed, over 600 wounded. What do we tell these young people and their families? What do we tell them? I'll tell you what we have to tell them. We have to tell them that their sacrifice was squandered by an administration that wanted out and didn't want to remain and consolidate the gains that was made through the sacrifice of American blood and treasure.
I'd be glad to respond to Senator McCain. Number one, to the average American, I understand being war-weary. Iraq and Afghanistan's been long, difficult wars, cost a lot of money, and